some questions that we have for the participating public. So starting off, I want to give a brief summary of the meeting that we had, the first public input session on August 27th. For those who were not in attendance, and also just as a refresher for some of the ground we covered, I do want to point out, if you're not already aware of it, that session was recorded and is on the DES website, in particular at the AoT webpage. So if anyone is interested and was not able to attend the first meeting, that's available there. And at that meeting, what we basically did was gave a brief overview of the Alteration of Terrain program and the development of the rule to where it stands today. The rule being ENVWQ 1503.19H, and that's really the rule that we have pertaining to T&E species and what we've been discussing in the last session, and we will further discuss today. We also had a brief overview provided by Chris Aslin on the legal framework for both the statutory authority to the Alteration of Terrain program, which is RSA 485A17, and 212A, which is a statutory authority under on Fish and Game. We then had a couple presentations, one being an overview on the environmental review program at Fish and Game, and that was provided to us by Melissa Doporalski of Fish and Game. And then we also had a presentation from Marianne Tilton of the Wetlands Bureau to give everyone a general feeling of the thought of avoidance, minimization, and mitigation as that could be used in other programs and perhaps could be applicable for this topic within the Alteration of Terrain program. But as I say, all of those could be reviewed on the webpage as they were recorded in the August 27th session. After that, during the session, we opened it up to the participants of the public, and I just wanted to briefly also go over some of the comments we received there. We received multiple comments in support of the idea of the avoidance, minimize, and mitigate approach, but it was also, I need to point out that it was stressed that the mitigation component should be the last of the 3 steps or options. People express that, avoidance and minimization is critical, and mitigation would be used only after evaluating avoidance and minimization. Also was stated that Fish and Game should consider whether additional rules are needed to better implement 212A. We had several people mention the need to maintain a science-based approach and suggested use of the Wildlife Action Plan. The statements were made that the standard, which is in the current rule, essentially saying not jeopardize the continued existence of T&E species, that we need to consider and define the geographic scope to which that would be applied. It was expressed the need to clearly define the standards and terminology to be used in any process, and also the need for some time standards or timelines to be established for reviewing such, for this whole process. And there was also questions as to who qualifies as a wildlife biologist and the expectations of the wildlife assessment study as it is required currently in the rule. And I will say, since the August 27th public input session, I want to point out, which is also up on our website, we did put out guidance on qualifications for a wildlife biologist, as well as a template for putting together a report of an assessment, a site assessment for T&E species. Both were developed with key input from New Hampshire Fish and Game. Everything we do is with coordinated with Fish and Game in this effort. And there was also comments received about the need for identifying perhaps additional support, additional funding for Fish and Game, so we can carry out the necessary duties to be able to review assessments as they come in. And that was about it for comments. You'll see in the questions that we're going to present in a little bit. It's kind of expanding upon some of those comments that we received. We've taken them under a lot of consideration, and it's generated additional questions, which was put out in the agenda that was posted a week or so ago. Hopefully you've had the opportunity to take a look at that. But after the presentation coming up shortly here, we'll get into those questions. And before we get started with a presentation that's going to be given to us by Mike Marchand at New Hampshire Fish and Game on the Wildlife Action Program and how it could be used in this process, I just wanted to briefly tell people that, you know, here today with myself representing DES and New Hampshire Fish and Game are Chris Aslan with the Attorney General's Office, Marianne Tilton with the Wetlands Bureau, Lori Summers, who runs the ARM Fund, and we also have Mike Marchand and Melissa Dabrowski from New Hampshire Fish and Game. So we're all available to certainly to listen, but to answer questions as necessary. But I do want to stress, which I'll probably do later on as well, that we're here to hear your ideas. We're not here necessarily to talk about the existing rule. We're trying to get input for development of a future rule. So with that said, and now I'd like to turn it over to Mike, and he can present his presentation on the Wildlife Action Plan. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to share a document. It'll take me just a second. All right, can somebody on the panel give me a okay, so it looks good?
Looks good.
Okay, thank you. All right, great. So I'm Mike Marchand. I'm the supervisor of the Non-Game and Endangered Wildlife Program. Before being in this role, I was a biologist in the program for about 15 years, doing a number of things, including participating in the Environmental Review Program. But I also assisted with the development of the Wildlife Action Plan. And so that's where we're going to spend about 20 minutes or so today presenting. As Ridge mentioned at the last meeting, there were several comments to the effect of wanting to maintain or improve a science-based approach in the rule process, as well as the Wildlife Action Plan mentioned several times. So I thought it would be helpful to just provide a real coarse view of the information we have in the Wildlife Action Plan and how we're using the Wildlife Action Plan now in the current process. And hopefully that will set the stage for any ideas people may have for discussion following that. All right. So first I'll mention that the presentation I'm giving today is a compilation of a number of presentations given over the years. I think our staff have probably given dozens and dozens of presentations over the years. This particular one was created, or this slide in particular was created in coordination with the Taking Action for Wildlife program. And I just point that out, that that's a partnership between New Hampshire Fish and Game, the Association of Conservation Commissions, and the University of New Hampshire Cooperative Extension, really designed to help communities, land trusts, individuals conserve wildlife and habitats in their area. And so I just mentioned it as a great resource following this. There's a lot of awesome information on that site. So I just wanted to mention that before we get going here. So the wildlife action plans were first created in 2005 and were revised in 2015. And these are requirements. There's one in every state in the country, and the requirements to participate and receive state wildlife grants, a Fish and Wildlife Service grant program. And they have pretty broad goals, and I think this will be important to recognize it for our discussion. So there is an important goal of restoring rare habitats and wildlife, and that's an important component, and that has strong overlap with some of the work we're going to discuss today. But the plans also have a much broader goal of keeping common species common. So we have this mixed goal of very broad actions, very broad goals of kind of maintaining the diversity and ecological integrity of the state of New Hampshire, as well as the other states, but also recovering those rare or imperiled species. So our wildlife action plan was developed in partnership with a very large number of groups, nonprofit governmental groups, some of which may be participating on the call here today. In addition, we had hundreds of individuals providing comment and participating in the process. So although New Hampshire Fish and Game was leading the process in the development of the Wildlife Action Plan and coordinating that, we really consider it a statewide plan for the conservation of wildlife in the state. And the partners and the public are really critical in the implementation of that plan. So we certainly appreciate all the hard work of others providing input during that process, as well as now during the implementation stage. So I'm going to start with the resource so that you don't try to take detailed notes here or try to find this information. So the entire Wildlife Action Plan is on our website. And I'll mention this because the actual Wildlife Action Plan, this is the only known version of the Wildlife Action Plan printed. And it's best measured in inches rather than pages. I measured it the other day because an individual requested it. It's about 6 inches thick, double-sided. And so very few people read it from front to cover, from cover to back. Usually they're going to certain components that they're looking for. So on our website, we have all these chapters separated as PDFs for download. Everything is on there, including some other information we'll discuss, the maps, some of the detailed metadata, and all the species are all in an appendix down below. So just want to point that out, and maybe in the chat, I'll put the direct link, but you can find it through wildnh.com and searching for Wildlife Action Plan. So I'm going to go through 3 components of the plan: the data, the maps, and then the actions that are being taken, because after all, it is the Wildlife Action Plan, and that's the focus of the plan. So we have 169 species, which we call species of greatest conservation need in the plan, as well as 27 habitat types. So for clarification, species of greatest conservation need is a larger list than those protected species that we often refer to and that are the focus here today, but they're inclusive of those species. And so this is the list in our plan here on the right. But that 169 includes our 30 species that are listed as protected and state endangered, such as the Blanding's turtle and brook floater mussel, the 21 species that are threatened, the black racer, the common loon, the various species of special concern, including wood turtle and bald eagle, as well as a number of other species, including brook trout and others. So just wanted to stress that this list is more inclusive than the threatened and endangered species list. We also include 27 key habitat types, and they span from alpine, top of mountains, to marine areas, and have a complete coverage of all the land cover in the state of New Hampshire. And part of the process is we evaluated threats for all of the species and the habitats in our plan, the species of greatest conservation need, that is, and the habitat types. And we evaluated them based on standardized threats that we were using that are nationally recognized, and evaluating for each of those species and habitats. So those are right up as a summary for each of those categories, which helps summarize those species that are most at risk from those various different threats. And I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but just wanted to show that we used a science-based approach to really evaluate the threats at the species and the habitat level using a standardized ranking process. And so that included things like the magnitude of the threat, which looked at the spatial extent, kind of the area of coverage, the severity, as well as some urgency factors like the immediacy, how certain it is, and the likelihood based on information. And we group those into categories of high, medium, and low based on the species interaction with the threat. Low isn't necessarily low or no threat, but relative to high and low, it was a lower ranking threat. All those threats were compiled on across all the habitats and species into an overall threat assessment. So at the top of the list, in terms of numbers identified, pollution was at the top. That's not the typical just, litter in the woods, but more about a large scale air, water pollution, things of that nature, point, non-point source pollution in aquatic systems, for example. We also ranked them across the threats in the high, medium, and the lows. So as an example of the type of data, we have those 169 species of greatest conservation need. Each of them has a species profile in the plan. And again, that's in the appendix of the plan. These are intended to be really concise documents that summarize the known information in New Hampshire. They're not comprehensive literature reviews. Many of them are 10 pages or under. And so they include the species status. So in this case, black racers are state threatened. The distribution of the species, each includes a map. And so here you see the full range is where you might predict the species to occur or known to occur, as well as the current condition, the quality of the habitat, any threats and actions, and any references used in the species profile. So some examples of threats that were identified, and I won't go through all these, but habitat conversion due to development of upland habitats, mortality of individuals from vehicles, human persecution, sadly, is still a really important one for snakes. People, unfortunately, still target snakes for killing. Habitat degradation due to succession. This is actually a species that uses younger forest habitat. So actually maturation of forest can actually lower the quality of the habitat over time. So it actually needs habitat management to maintain itself as habitat. And mortality from welded plastic erosion control blankets, which Melissa mentioned a bit in her presentation at the last meeting. In terms of actions, again, these would each be identified as well as have a short description in the species profile of the Wildlife Action Plan, but document communal den sites, protecting critical habitats at priority locations, and promoting wildlife-friendly erosion control. And again, that's something that Melissa has promoted as part of the last meeting, as well as interactions with consultants over time. Just to show you what that is as an example, this is a welded plastic erosion control netting. We've documented multiple black racers captured, as well as hognose snakes caught in it. It kills the snakes. They basically move through it, and their scales get stuck in the welded plastic, and they aren't able to back out of the materials. It is known to also kill a number of other species in wildlife, including birds, even fish when it's in the aquatic environment. We also did the same type of assessment for 27 different habitat profiles that we have. For example, floodplain forest. I'm not going to go through the details here, just to know that all that information is in there at the habitat level, just like it was at the species level. Okay, moving on to maps. Maps are what people really know us most for in terms of the Wildlife Action Plan, and probably what they use most commonly. I wanted to go through that other information because that 1,000+ pages of material that I showed you is really about other stuff and not just about maps. So it's more than the maps, but the maps are important and are used heavily. So we have a number of different sets of maps, and I'll go through each of these briefly, but we have a land cover map, as well as a ranking process where we have highest ranked wildlife habitat by ecological condition. So first, land cover. Many of you that have used the maps are probably most familiar with the terrestrial and wetlands land cover maps, and you see that different habitat types there on the left-hand side. As I mentioned, it's a complete coverage of the state from mountaintop to sea coast, and inclusive of all the various habitat types that could be mapped. And does not include some of the smaller scale habitat, like vernal pools that were unable to be mapped based on existing GIS information, but includes the vast majority of the types. We also have an aquatic map, and so on the terrestrial wetlands, those are identified as open water or surface water features, but we further refine those into an aquatic map, which includes cold and warm water lake and pond habitats, as well as warm and cool streams and rivers. So that helps associate those habitat types with different species across the landscape. Okay, and then so here is the land cover map zoomed into a town level. And that is just as an example purposes. So on our website, Fish and Game website, we have we actually created maps by the community, by the town. So each town can download those. And we have each set of maps already pre-created. So they're just could be downloaded for your purposes at the town level. All the information is, the actual data is also available for download on Granite, the UNH data storage clearinghouse, as well as for simple viewing on Granite View. But here you can see kind of an example of the different types of habitats in a landscape. Just really quickly on this one, our 27 habitat types were kind of coarse habitat types that people kind of commonly understand. But those are broken in the actual data into many more different habitat types based on more of a natural community type. And so the Wildlife Action Plan has a crosswalk to these natural community types. And so if one was interested in gathering more information at a finer scale than the habitat type, there's information to help along the way predict which natural community types might be associated with that given habitat at a given location. Okay, moving into the condition assessment. And so this was done at a statewide scale, and it was done on a per habitat scale. So within each habitat type, we assessed a relative rank of using 3 factors: biological factors, which are looking at the number of rare species, including both plants and wildlife; landscape factors, which include things like size of the habitat, proximity to other patches; and human impact score, things like proximity to development or roads. So all the metadata associated with this analysis is available on our website for a closer look. And so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of more detail, but these were ranked into 3 categories: those at the highest ranked in New Hampshire, so relative to all other of a given habitat across the entire state; highest ranked in a biological region, so relative to a smaller area after the highest rank, they were the kind of the next tier up, as well as those that are in a supporting landscape, which are supporting to 2 and 1. So again, just an example from the town of Epping, looking at that town level ecological ranking map of condition. So just wanted to mention one thing, because I think I think it will be helpful for our discussion, but the Wildlife Action Plan maps are not exactly equivalent to, say, endangered species maps. The known priority areas where known for threatened and endangered species are incorporated into the map. So the maps are really useful and critical for conservation planning and implementation of threatened and endangered species. They are our go-to documents. But I wanted to point out that those tier 1 and tier 2 areas include areas that do not necessarily have known occurrences of threatened and endangered species, because they're much more broad than that. They're looking at diversity of species and ecological condition of the landscape, not just threatened and endangered species. And those maps may also exclude areas where there are actual occurrences. Not every single occurrence across the entire of threatened and endangered species may be represented in those areas across the entire landscape. So I just wanted to point that out for future consideration. Another resource we have available to folks is on the website. we've developed predicted species of conservation need by town. So you can go and click on the town just like you can for those maps, the habitat and the scoring maps, and click on species. And you can generate a list of all the species of greatest conservation need that may occur in that given town. And that's simply based on the distribution of those species. Those species, many of the species may not actually occur in a town based on the habitat within a given town or at a given property. But it provides a shorter list than the 169 of those species that might actually occur based on where the species are known or predicted to occur across the landscape. So finally, I'll wrap up quickly with action. So first, I'll say we assessed our performance within the first 10 years of the Wildlife Action Plan between 2005 and 15, and had some great successes. Over 235,000 of priority landscape was protected, and this is really and thanks to our partners working and using our Wildlife Action Plan and doing that great work. We also provided 3,500 plus technical assistance events to towns or private landowners or others on the management or protection of wildlife. And we had a lot of great work in monitoring and conservation actions specifically pertaining and targeting species and habitats. So all the actions in the Wildlife Action Plan are can be found in either the species or the habitat profiles, or the much broader actions are in Chapter 5. So many of these actions are related to species or are proactive, looking at conservation across the landscape. Some of those larger actions pertaining to today's discussion can be found in 3,300 under environmental review, but also might mix into some of these other categories. For example, just a few examples of actions identified in the Wildlife Action Plan include restore and mimicking natural flows in streams and rivers, improving intra and interagency coordination for environmental review. So to some extent, that's what this process of getting input from the public and potential future revisions to rules hopefully will provide that greater coordination for both agencies as well as the public. And the last one is one of the topics for discussion today: secure funding to increase biological interaction time. So these items were recognized in the 2015 Wildlife Action Plan, and today's process is in some sense helping us implement the Wildlife Action Plan. So just to summarize quickly, the current uses of the Wildlife Action Plan, the species and habitat information can be used for project-specific reviews to gather the information on a given habitat type or species and the current information. And the most common use is using the maps. And so those are used as a tool for evaluating site condition, and also in the mitigation world associated with selection of sites and evaluating sites. I'll mention that there was a report published by the Nature Conservancy and Environmental Law Institute at the national level a few years back that was promoting that linkage of using wildlife action plans and mitigation programs to create that strong linkage of really enhancing mitigation programs and making them more effective at protecting the best ecological areas. So in the wetlands rules, there's actually for the programmatic general permit, the Army Corps has what's called an Appendix B, and it's a checklist, and they have a question that pertains to whether an area is in a wildlife action plan priority area, yes or no. Within the wetlands rules, there's a number of places. I essentially did a search for all the locations where it's mentioned, and you could do the same there. I'm going to go through this section relatively quickly. It's defined, but basically everywhere wildlife action plan is currently being used is associated with mitigation, either during a pre-application phase of identifying the current condition or the current wildlife action plan of the project site, as well as any areas that you're proposing for mitigation, either through mitigation selected by the applicant or mitigation through other programs. So another compensatory mitigation under 803. Again, under mitigation, wildlife action plan. And then under the Aquatic Resource Mitigation Program, which is a type of mitigation program, you can actually get higher points in the ranking associated with wildlife action plans. So there's actually criteria how each project is evaluated and ranked. And if you're in all those wildlife action plan priority areas, you get extra points. So the final slide I'll end with, associated with that aquatic resource mitigation program. This is the materials provided by DES, just demonstrating that that aquatic resource mitigation program has had an association with implementing the wildlife action plan. So here you have tier 1, 2, and 3, and looks like they've that program is protected almost or about 20,000 acres in the state since the start, including a bunch of vernal pools, brook trout habitat, etc. Much of that habitat is in southern New Hampshire, and because of the way the program works and how the fees are generated with impacts, many of our threatened and endangered species are in the southern part of the state, and so there is this close link between a lot of that habitat that's protected and habitat for threatened and endangered species. As an example, Blanding's turtle habitat, those areas are mapped, and so there's been almost 4,000 acres protected specifically for Blanding's turtles, priority areas through the Aquatic Resource Mitigation Program. Same thing with New England cottontail, smaller number, but about 330, I think that number is. It's small even on my screen, but a number of acres protected for these species. Just as an example, those are additional benefits of the program, and not necessarily the primary target, but those also are included in the scoring and the ranking of priority projects. So I'll wrap up there. I appreciate, look forward to the discussion, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mike. For everyone who's attending, I wanted to, this is Tom Taggart again, tech support for this. I wanted to make sure if you are having trouble finding the Q&A panel that I gave you the correct information, because this may have changed since our last input session. So on the slides I showed before, I pointed out that there was a circle with 3 vertical dots kind of highlighted by this arrow and the number 1, and that would bring a pop-up where there'd be a Q&A bubble that you could hit. It would open up the Q&A side panel. Since some people's bars in the WebEx interface are showing up a little differently, you might be seeing it like this now, where instead of little circles, you've got kind of ovals. And I wanted to say that the participant window, the chat window, please use the chat window if you're experiencing technical problems. Chat me, Tom Taggart, the host. And then the Q&A is actually, all these things are off to the bottom right in many people's windows. You're going to be looking for that horizontal dot on the far right there. Clicking that will have a little pop-up appear. And then clicking within that pop-up where it says Q&A will open up the Q&A panel for you. So this may be how it's showing up for some people now in the current WebEx setup, and this may be how it's showing up for others. So once again, please call me at 603-271-8156 or chat me if you can open the chat window, chat the host, Tom Taggart, if you're running into any problems. I'm going to turn it back over to Ridge now. Thank you all for letting me jump in there.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Mike, for that presentation on the Wildlife Action Plan. At this point, I want to soon open it up to the questions that we had put out about a week ago that, as I said earlier, hopefully you've all had a chance to give some thought. And this is really the guts of this public input session. We're seeking your input as to some of these questions to help guide the departments in rural development. And pertaining to rural development, I just want to briefly say that we've received in the past couple weeks numerous emails of comment from members of the public, and in a lot of those it seems to be expressing people have concerns that we've already developed a rule or we've already targeted certain things in a rule, and that's not the case. This is the beginning of the process. We're seeking input. We have not put pen to paper to even start drafting rules. Once we do that, there'll be more opportunity for public input, and we have an internal schedule that I briefly talked about in the August session that if we can stay on schedule, we would be looking towards developing a rule and having it presented to the Joint Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules at the end of April. Now it may be even closer to May because we're a little bit behind schedule, if you will. So I just wanted to state that because, as I said, it seems like there's the perception of some that we're already have developed a rule. We have our current rule, and as I said earlier, we're not really here to debate the merits of the current rule. Certainly we can use that as some guidelines, and we have had a lot of comments on the qualified biologist and the report, the assessment, and the lack of a format for that, which we think we've addressed by putting out a template. With that said, we didn't have a question pertaining to our existing rule, but realizing that some of that rule may be used moving forward, I'm suggesting at the end of the 7 questions, hopefully we'll still have some time. We can talk at that point, seek input on the term of qualified wildlife biologist and what the contents of a report should be. With that said, we always welcome input. I will say I think the department and Fish and Game has a pretty good sense of areas where we need to further explore and areas where perhaps improvement or move forward on those 2 issues because we're working it as we speak. We're having reports come in. But I just wanted to say that before we get into these other 7 questions, to acknowledge that we've had a lot of comments and we're aware that there's some comments on the wildlife biologists and the report requirements as they stand today. So without saying anything more on that, I'd like to move into the questions. And if you, Tom, could let me share a screen.
You are now the presenter, Rich.
Okay, thank you. Are the questions showing up right now?
Not yet.
Not yet. Hang on a second. Oh, that's the wrong screen. Sorry about that. Let me do screen 2. Is that showing up?
Yep.
I see it's not centered, but hopefully, I'm not quite sure why that is. Let me see if I can do something with that on the layout.
Go back to view or home, Rich.
Yeah.
And then do page width or 1 page. Yeah.
Yeah. I can do that. Yeah, that works. Thanks. So we put this at the top, I think, for good reason, since you just saw a presentation on the Wildlife Action Plan. So we ask you as the participating audience, members of the public, to what extent should the Wildlife Action Plan play a role in the review of T&E impacts? And we will open that up to question, and Tom will recognize people and unmute them.
Hi, Jennifer McCourt. I'm about to unmute you. Please go ahead.
Hi. My question would be, no, I guess, do I mute myself so I don't echo?
We're not hearing an echo on this side, Jennifer.
Okay, great. My question would be, is, the Wildlife Action Plan and what role that it pertains is a pretty large question. And I think that, like we had done when we redid the AoT rules, is that there needs to be more of a committee that is formed to look at that entire question, because Michael went into, there's places where you have high consideration for the Wildlife Action Plan, but you might not have any threatened and endangered species in there. And how do you roll that into the report, and what action should that have in this? And it's, a very big question. And to do this over such a short period of time with all of these different questions that you have, I think they need to be looked at by a committee that's formed with a bunch of people that have standing here and not just Fish and Game. I know you have people here, but are we really representing everybody that needs to be represented? That's all I have for this one.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm going to put you back on mute. Next up, we have Richard Head. Richard, you are unmuted.
Great, thank you. Thank you all, first off, before I get started, for doing this in this presentation and taking the time today. These are difficult to put together, and very much appreciate you doing this. I'm Richard Head. Although I'm a lawyer at Rathjong and Pignatelli, I have been representing and continue to represent some individuals that are challenging AoT projects due to potential or actual impacts to threatened and endangered species. For purposes of my comments today, though, I am not representing anybody. So I want to be clear that notwithstanding in court, I'm representing individuals. In my comments here today, they're mine personally, and not comments of Rathjong and Pignatelli, and not comments of the clients I represent. One of the things I wanted to say about the question is that it is hard to respond to in this context, in that it's almost like a multiple choice question, but only A is being presented. And what I mean by that is, I think it's probably undisputed that the Wildlife Action Plan plays a role. And your question is, what role should it play? And it is one tool of a host of potential tools out there that could play a role in any evaluation of impacts to threatened and endangered species. It is certainly, I think, in any evaluation as a screening process, one of the tools that almost certainly has to be on the checklist of evaluating potential impacts to threatened and endangered species, similar to any other lists that are out there. What threatened and endangered species have been identified on this particular property? What are the conservation lands surrounding a particular project? So I think it is, without question, a tool that gets used in any screening process, but it does not and should not be used as a tool that results in an answer in and of itself. It is simply as part of the initial evaluation of potential impacts to T&E species that a project may cause. One element that should be examined in every case, but should not be relied upon to provide an answer, because I think every case is probably, or every project may have a different mix of data that's available to it. This is a data point that is available statewide, so should be evaluated as almost part of a mandatory checklist item, but not be used as a tool that provides an answer in and of itself. Meaning, essentially, if you're within a particular characteristic area, that doesn't necessarily result in an answer, yes or no. You need to take the next step. I think it's just one of the evaluative tools that should be looked at the very beginning of any project. And with that, that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Good afternoon. Hello, you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Could you please identify yourself?
Hello, yes, this is Zach Boyajian of the Department of Military Affairs and Veteran Services. I'm an environmentalist there, both involved in project reviews that take place for our agency, projects that are being constructed, as well as managing a number of properties that the agency holds. Two things kind of jumped out at me from Mike's presentation about the Wildlife Action Plan, and I kind of agree partly with Mr. Head there. As a screening tool, there's some very valuable things in there, particularly maybe even before a project is even being proposed by somebody, or when a wildlife biologist is looking to do their evaluation of the site, that the species predicted by town would be a really helpful tool for those people to go and utilize when they're going for their on-site evaluation. The other thing that I thought about, which relates directly to the kind of the review process, was that you guys evaluated the types of threats associated with all these species, and that could be used in that review process. So you do identify that maybe T&E species is in your project area or partially using your project area. Those threats that were identified in the Wildlife Action Plan should certainly be looked at as whether or not your project is providing any of those threats or not, and to what degree. That's it.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate it.
Okay, next up, there are some questions that were submitted in the Q&A panel. If Mike or Rich, you guys wanted to look at those. Two of them were about the Wildlife Action Plan, I believe.
Okay, I see one from Jared Jones here. I might need him to follow up with the question. It says, the Department of Military Affairs is land-owning land management agency that complies with multiple federal and state directives such as ESA, NEPA, Sykes Act. Make well-informed decisions in the context of these directives. We conduct extensive planning level surveys and know our lands and associated natural resources intimately. I don't see a follow-up to that. If there's a, yep, I guess there's a continuation. Are we able to leverage these surveys in lieu of having a certified wildlife biologist conduct them? These may be anywhere from 1 to 5 years old, potentially older. So that's I don't know if Ridge or Melissa want to jump on that one. That doesn't seem to be pertaining directly to the Wildlife Action Plan, but maybe more about the current process. I'm not sure if you want to provide some direction on that now, or. I'll say as they jump in, I mean, obviously, any information you have for any property is going to be valuable to incorporate into any decision-making process. So certainly, it's useful and valuable information. I will say that.
Mike, it looks like there's a couple questions regarding the WAP specifically.
Okay.
One from Jim O'Brien asking if you can explain how the WAP has been used by the department in making decisions or reviewing previous AoT permit recommendations.
Sure. Yeah, that's, if someone could just read the questions, that's helpful for me. So yeah, thanks, Jim. I appreciate that. I would say in general, in the permitting world, the Wildlife Action Plan is used how Richard had described. It's used as a tool to screen and look at projects, not as a decision-making tool. I would say that's probably, there's a longer history of that on the wetland side than the alteration of terrain side, simply because it's the wetlands rules are older, and there's more integration with the Wildlife Action Plan there. But that's generally how it can or would be used, is kind of something to look at more. The current process that we're not going to go into a lot today, but that new template that was developed and released incorporates the Wildlife Action Plan into that study design and gathering that information. So again, it would be a tool in assessing a given site, knowing that those areas are recognized as, high ecological areas, but not necessarily associated with a threatened endangered species. So it is a tool, and that's how we use it.
So, Mike, I see another question from it's like from Ari Pollock, and that is it fair to say that the WAP is similar to the NHB database in a preliminary screening tool, but then supplemented with other and more site-specific information?
Thank you. It's a great question. I think to some extent, because yes and no. I mean, the Natural Heritage Bureau is based on known occurrences, so that information really is a known entity. But certainly, it doesn't cover the whole state and all sites, and so supplementing that information with known site information is certainly valuable. In a similar way, wildlife action plans are generated at a scale that's much larger than a property basis. It's mostly GIS information at a much larger scale. And so on-site information and knowledge of a given habitat is generally always going to be better than modeled information. And so I agree that taking that as a starting point, looking at it as as a screening tool, but then supplementing that with your knowledge of on-site information is a good approach.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. This is Ridge. I didn't mean to appear to leave you hanging out to dry. You were reading a question from here that was not on my screen, but I think I'm caught up. The last question I see was from Kim Wood, asking, are erosion blankets banned by the Wildlife Action Plan? If not, should they be?
I'm going to let others jump in on that. I think our approach at Fish and Game has been, I mean, certainly when there's a threatened and endangered species present in an area, we provide that strong recommendation or condition to find alternatives on a site design. Whenever they can be, we prefer alternatives in all sites, recognizing that may not be the option. And so I think there's still, I'll let DES jump in. I think, those still are allowed in situations. Our review provides, tries to provide alternatives. So I believe the answer is that the welded plastic erosion control are still allowed. I know the Department of Transportation has included options for the wildlife erosion control as an alternative in some circumstances, especially in temporary situations. But I would, if that's the kind of the level of my knowledge on that. So if others want to jump in, feel free on the panel.
Yeah, Ridgemark here. I would say, to my knowledge, excuse me, there's not an outright ban, but that's become kind of a universal comment to the consulting world, if you will, that, as Mike says, there are alternative products out there. So we're starting to see plans more and more frequently coming into us, even initially without such products, using alternative products. So not banned, but we're not seeing their use as frequently as we did in the past. At this point, I failed to mention, just trying to keep track of time. If more questions come in related to the Wildlife Action Plan, we can circle back. But I'm trying to keep to about 20 minutes per question. There may be some questions here that don't generate as much comment. And then, of course, we could come back, but I want to make sure we leave enough time. So I'd like to, at this point, move on to question number 2. Review of the potential impacts to T&E species must be conducted at a geographic scale related to a proposed project. At what geographical scale should T&E impacts be considered during environmental review to satisfy and this is the condition, not jeopardize the continued existence standard in RSA 212? So we'd welcome any comment on that, ideas on how to define the geographical scale. So I'm seeing some questions starting to come in. And I think this is easiest not to need to unmute. Certainly if people want to say more, we could go back to that format. But Josh Manning asked, what geographical scale is presently used with NHB data check? And I would need to defer to Mike or Melissa on that.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? What
geographical scale is presently used with the NHB data check?
I can start with that. I mean, the NHB data check is based on known occurrences. And so when, so there's so it's basically what threatened and endangered species are known to occur on or in close proximity to a property. If that answers the question.
So Tom, did we have any hands raised, people wishing to speak to share their ideas on this topic?
Yes, we do, Rich. Did you want me to go down the list, or did you want to pick people off the list and I'll announce them?
Okay, well, I didn't realize it was just on these questions. Then why don't we unmute Christine Perron?
Okay. Christine, you're unmuted.
Thank you. My only comment or suggestion is that you consider the Section 7 definition of a project's action area when considering impacts. So that's looking at all direct and indirect impacts that the project could result in.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I think Christine is referring to the Federal Endangered Species Act, Section 7, correct?
Correct. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, and we also have a comment from Suzanne Fournier. Tom, if you could unmute her.
Suzanne, you're unmuted and ready to go.
Well, until we hear, we're not getting anything from Suzanne. Her question was very succinct, and maybe this is worth for people hearing. The question was, doesn't NHB use about a mile around a project site? And I'm assuming she's saying for the NHB data check that they report, presence of species out to a mile. Could Mike or Melissa answer that?
Yeah, there's a screening layer that's basically created from the known occurrence information, and there's a buffer around those known occurrences, and it's somewhat variable based on the mobility of that given species. So it's not consistently the same distance. So in some cases it may be approaching that distance, but in many cases it might be much smaller than that.
Makes sense to go through all the.
All right, next, excuse me. Next up, I'm going to unmute Carol Foss, who submitted both a question and has her hand raised here. Carol, you're unmuted.
Okay, thank you. I may be looking at that question in a slightly different way, but I'm thinking that this geographical scale issue is something that kind of goes back to the usefulness of the Wildlife Action Plan, in that there is a map there of prospective and known locations. So if your species of concern is something that only occurs in 2 municipalities out of the whole state, that gives you a very different geographical context for looking at impacts from something that occurs at scattered locations throughout the state. And I think considering impacts in the context of the species distribution in the entire state is important in the review process.
All right, thank you, Carol. Next one. Did any of the panelists want to add anything before I move on?
Nope, just thank you, Carol.
All right, now Rick Vanderpool, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Tom. Rick Vanderpool, representing myself. I agree with Carol. It's completely species dependent. And moreover, I believe the geographic scale needs to be understood by whoever's doing the assessment to span the entire species range. For example, we have a lot of species that are here just as stopover species. We have things like American pipit up in the alpine zone, things that are may be seen in other sites as they migrate through. But the question really becomes, what is the critical habitat for the species, and does obviously the project impact that critical habitat, whether or not the species is present? And I think that's one of the going to be one of the tricky parts in answering that question. Certainly, as Carol said, if you have a species that's only known from a couple of towns versus scattered throughout the state, that's going to have a different sort of level of review. But there's so much we do not know about the species that occur on the landscape that even if we project our best estimate of good habitat being present, without further study, we will never know exactly how much of an impact our projects are going to have until we do have a better sense of all of the critical habitats that species requires. So, it sort of gets back at I wish I could wave a magic wand and fund fish and game at a level to where those answers could be provided from information that's already been researched. But certainly, I would encourage the team or review panel to consider the depth of that variation of how critical is it, and where does the species occur on a natural basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick, and I'll be interested if you find that magic wand. Let me know.
Yeah.
All right, next up, I'm going to unmute Richard Heed or Richard Head. Richard, you're unmuted.
Great, thank you. Richard Head again, as talking on my own behalf. I guess the point I wanted to focus on is I'm concerned about the standard that's described in this question, which is the geographical scale for review to satisfy the not jeopardize the continued existence of threatened and endangered species. And my concern is that when you look at the T&E statute and Fish and Game statute, it has as a purpose to maintain and enhance threatened and endangered species, and it also makes it unlawful to take. And take has a very broad definition of not only kill, but to harass, to put at risk, it has a whole list of language that's associated with the word take. And I would be concerned if a AoT rule incorporated a standard of not jeopardizing the continued existence, which strikes me as a very low threshold as compared to the very high standards that are described in the statute, the underlying statute that is really trying to be implemented here, which talks about not only just maintaining, but enhancing threatened and endangered species, and also that very baseline standard of making it unlawful to take any threatened or endangered species. So it strikes me that if the goal is to not jeopardize the continued existence through an AoT rule, that it's applying the wrong standard. So setting that aside, with regard to geographic area, one, I agree with the comments about it will depend on the species. That's that issue, and will depend very much on the study that would need to be performed to identify how the target species are using the property. Where are they using it for overwintering? Where are they going for breeding purposes? Where are they going for spring feeding? Whatever the life cycle of whatever the target species is going to ultimately determine the geographical area that needs to be evaluated. A project may impact only one small part of that overall sort of yearly life cycle of the target animal, but that particular very small area of impact may be 100% critical to the overall survivability of that species in that area. And then my final comment is that with regard to the geographical area, it is on a animal by animal basis. So I don't think you can look to saying, this particular project may have an impact on the Blandings turtles in this particular location, but within the state of New Hampshire, the species is going to be fine. I think you have to say, in this particular location, the death of a single turtle may eliminate the survivability of this particular group of Blandings turtles, because their ability now to mate is reduced substantially given the overall low survivability of offspring and blah blah blah. So I would be concerned if the goal was to say, in a larger geographical area, the species will survive, even though in this very localized area, we may wipe out the species altogether. And with that, those are the comments I had. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Hey, this is Tom Taggart. I just want to put out a reminder for attendees who have their hand raised and have submitted a question to remember to Lord, unless you want to submit another question. That'll allow us to separate out people who are done talking from those who want to add another comment. And now I was going to read a question from Rebecca Martin. She asks, thinking about the language in the rule about not jeopardizing the continued existence of TNE species, does the WAP talk at all about critical habitat for endangered species in New Hampshire? Has there been any thought of prioritizing the most rare habitats in New Hampshire?
I'll try to jump in on that. I didn't hear all of the question. I heard about trying the critical habitat, and has there been efforts to prioritize species conservation areas or for a particular species? Was that the gist of the question?
Mike, let me, maybe I'll come through more clearly.
Okay.
The question was, does the Wildlife Action Plan talk at all about critical habitat for endangered species in New Hampshire? And part two was, has there been any thought of prioritizing the most rare habitats in New Hampshire?
Thank you. Okay, I'll take a first stab at that. So the Wildlife Action Plan does not include explicit maps for those areas. Some of these species are sensitive to things like collection or from the public, so we often don't release those specific species-specific priority maps to the public for that reason. However, some of that information is embedded, as I mentioned, within the Wildlife Action Plan maps, and where we know about that. So for Blandings turtles, for instance, through a regional effort working with conservation partners across the New England, New York, Pennsylvania landscape, there's been a tremendous effort to look at all the Blandings turtle areas and identify focal areas. So there has been an effort underway to from a proactive conservation planning side of things, to prioritize the best of the best sites. Similar efforts have been done for some other species, but not all species. And so the answer is, for some species, we do have priority areas for threatened and endangered species. For some species, we do not have that prioritization process. But I will acknowledge that not all occurrences are of equal viability for a given species. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in on that, or that adequately addresses the question.
Thank you, Mike. Tom, did we have any more people with their hands raised pertaining to this question?
I believe so, Rich. It looks like we have three people who want to submit comments. Jennifer McCourt, Kim Wood, and Zachary Boyajian. I can start with Jennifer here. Jennifer, you are unmuted.
I have put a question under the question and answer part. I haven't been able to lower my hand. It won't let me. It was, basically what a lot of them had said is that it sounds like this question needs a lot more research into it to be able to answer it because it's not a one-size-fit-all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Next up is Kim Wood. Kim, you're unmuted.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can.
Oh, good. Can you consider, when you're thinking about the geographical area, can you consider effects that a given developmental effort might have upstream or downstream on maybe species that are not in that particular area, but might be affected by the activities in an area that's nearby or maybe even not nearby?
Well, perhaps Fish and Game gives that a little thought. I mean, the one area I can think of as an engineer, but working with these guys on these type projects, well, we do take into consideration wildlife corridors. So that would be one area where you'd have that connection, if you will. And, downstream, all I can think of is, because it comes up on a lot of projects, is, that if you're potentially having any impacts to the water. I know you mean downstream, meaning, not in a water body, but that is one case where it would certainly be considered, like for the mussel. But I'll defer to Fish and Game to expand upon that.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my example of a case where we would clearly look at the effects upstream for say an aquatic system under the wetlands permitting process. Being a known threat to a given endangered mussel, we'd be looking at say sedimentation upstream or making sure appropriate precautions are in place to reduce sedimentation for that given species downstream. So that's a clear case where work up in an aquatic flowing system upstream has the potential to affect something downstream. So it would be a case where we would clearly look at those situations. But
All right, next up we have Zachary Erosion. Sorry for the last name. Zachary, you're unmuted.
Thank you. Two things kind of occur to me when thinking about this geographic question, and I tried to kind of think through this. Are there kind of categories of geographic areas that we would that could be considered as the geographic space that you're going to evaluate? The first one obviously is very simply the project area itself. But I don't really think that's what's the intent of this meaning. Because if the project area is developed, then obviously there's nothing there, right? Secondly, and I think more appropriately, is the site and the contiguous habitat that a particular species might be using. And that could be, it could be still very, very localized, or it could be very broad, depending on how much habitat's in close proximity to your project area. Kind of thirdly, is really like statewide, and that came up. Richard kind of talked a little bit about that earlier. What are, the geographic area could be evaluated on a statewide scale, but again, that's very, very broad. And doesn't really address necessarily local things going on. And lastly, range-wide could be evaluated too, and that might be even larger than the state, right? So it seems to me that providing a balance in terms of geographic scale relates to the project itself and the contiguous habitat that's there that one or more individuals of a species might be using for, all or part of their life cycle, as kind of a minimum area that would be evaluated at least. But the other thing, and the second thing that I think you should probably consider, because there is, the federal regulations, what the Fish and Wildlife Service uses as a standard for determining jeopardy opinions. I think they probably use a much more broader scale, but it might be worthwhile looking at some examples of how they've and when they've done that, because that might be something that gets used in any sort of protest or pushback to an opinion that says you're going to jeopardize the continued existence of a species.
Thank you, Zachary. I'm going to suggest at this point we need to move on to the next question, but looking at the time that we have and the time remaining, I have at 2:32. I'm going to suggest we take a 5-minute break so people can get up and just stretch, and we'll be back to continue this discussion at 2:37 or 5 minutes from whatever your clock says right now. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Hope you enjoyed your 5 minutes. To keep us on schedule, I'd like to get going again on to question 3 or C regarding, well, I'll just read it, at least the beginning part. Several commenters raised the avoid, minimize, and mitigate standard as a possible approach for review of T&E impacts. For comparison, in the wetlands context, the following definitions are used. And I'm not going to read those. You can read them yourself. They're wetlands definitions by rule. So we ask for your input on what does it mean to avoid and minimize impacts in the context of threatened and endangered species. And while you're thinking about that and hopefully raising hands, I did want to say during the August session, someone asked if we could provide what proportion of projects, and this is in the wetlands context, are addressed through avoidance, what proportion through minimization, and what proportion through mitigation. So we looked into that, and we don't break it down to that level of scale, if you will, but looking at the wetlands database and information data gathered over about a 5-year period, we were able to provide that from wetlands permit applications when they come in, the total impacts that are proposed by the applicant, the proponent of the project, till the time we go through the review process, we saw about a 20% reduction in total wetlands impacts. So you could say the avoidance and minimization standard resulted in about a 20% reduction over that 5-year period. Now, with that said, the data that is gathered is not into detail that we could answer specific questions as to what type of wetlands, what was the functions and values of a particular wetlands. It's my understanding that the department is looking into enhancements to the database, but that's the best information I'm able to share at this point. So we welcome some input you would have onto, I'll repeat it again, what does it mean to avoid and minimize impacts in the context of T&E species? And Tom, you will be calling on hands or unmuting. I see Tom O'Brien has his hand up.
Tom O'Brien, you are unmuted.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry to kind of jump maybe to more of an end of the conversation here, but I have a meeting I have to host at 2:50 p.m. And the question really is, avoiding and minimizing are one thing. And the question I have around threatened and endangered species, is there a point does New Hampshire Fish and Game acknowledge that does it have the ability, and does it acknowledge and exercise the ability to at some point say no? Say no to a project because its implementation, regardless of mitigation techniques, will result in unavoidable adverse impacts to threatened and endangered species. And we could take extreme examples of where there's few viable populations left. But, rather than get into all kinds of scenarios, the question is there a bottom line? Because it seems to me we are going to minimize these species out of existence if we can't say no to any project. And so I didn't see any recognition of that and haven't heard that yet in this whole process. And I'll be quiet now. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Does anyone from Fish and Game?
I'll give a brief answer. I appreciate the comments. I know that's a concern of many folks. I believe that's a specific question we were looking for input on. I'd have to scroll down here, the list. Letter F. So that is on our list of when it's appropriate for denial. So that's actually something we were looking for public input on here today. So I appreciate that. And I guess the answer is yes. I think we're I think that's part of our role in the review and evaluation. And we've certainly heard that thus far that, we don't want folks to, that's some of the public input thus far is the hesitancy and desire to not jump right to mitigation. So no, that wasn't a perfect answer, but I want to acknowledge your concerns and your comments. And I think that's something we're looking for input from folks on.
Okay, thank you, Michael. And again, I'm sorry to have, if I jumped ahead here, only because I have to leave early. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Mike. We'll call now on Gary Abbott.
Gary, you are unmuted.
Thank you. Thank you, Ridge. Thank you, Michael, for the great presentation that you gave regarding the Wildlife Action Plan. And I guess I didn't know it was as large as what you showed on the screen. I want to make a comment that I believe this avoid, minimize, and mitigate language that is used under wetlands is really the critical part in what I'm looking at for applicants. If I look at the Fish and Game Chapter 212A, the Roman 3, I've read it a number of times during this presentation, and it seems to be kind of almost on this same guideline of avoid, minimize, or mitigate in the language it uses, except it comes to the determination that if the executive director thinks it's critical, it becomes a different level. And I think Michael kind of explained that with the Wildlife Action Plan and when we talk about some of these things that are in A and B. So I think it's already there under the Fish and Game statute. I think the issue that we have is that we had some bad language under the rules of DES, and clearly on behalf of the members that I have, I think we need this avoid, minimize, and mitigate. And we need to have Fish and Game to have rules to address this critical threshold. And I think that is really, just listening today, by the rules that were adopted in June, we still have not resolved so many issues about scope, impact, what a wildlife biologist does. A lot of that has created what I consider a large moving target that we need to really kind of scope down to what these projects need to be reviewed and what we need to provide. And I know that's what these sessions are all about, but I do believe we have a functioning system under wetlands, but I recognize even under that system, we need some Fish and Game rules in case of denial, in case of an objection, and some timeframes. There needs to be something for applicants to be able to respond to if it gets into the Fish and Game's hands. But I think this is the most critical part of whether we look back now and revise the rules to kind of mirror what already is a work that we use under wetlands and move in that direction. Because the top part about wildlife action plans and your further questions about what a wildlife biologist does just doesn't seem to hit the major thing that we're looking at. And I'm kind of giving the big overview that when I listen to the scope and it be referred to as something we should look at as a statewide basis, I recognize we have a problem. Because I don't think that's the role of these rules. It's to deal with an alteration of terrain permit, a specific site. So I guess I just wanted to input that I'm looking at what you have outlined as this third one, to me is the biggest of addressing how we should proceed with rulemaking in the future. And I just wanted to make that point. And again, I appreciate everybody that's online and you taking this input electronically during this coronavirus. But again, I appreciate it very much. But I do think, I think we already have this avoid, minimize. It's just not in place under the alteration of terrain rules. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Gary, this is Ridge Mock. If I could just add for everyone's consideration, what we're trying to, I think I hear from you that there's some validity to this approach. I think people recognize it's a very difficult issue. What we're trying to get is a little bit more specific. I mean, as a layperson, if you will, or an engineer and not a biologist, a wildlife scientist, what have you, is, avoid and minimize in the wetlands context could be a bit different than in the alteration of terrain context. I think of one thing in particular. Wetlands are stationary objects, tend to be a little bit smaller projects, not always. Alteration of terrain, by definition, since they have to be over 2.3 acres generally to even come into our purview. Our larger projects, we're dealing with species that move. And so that's where we're trying to get, in that context, some people's ideas on avoid and minimize. And with that, I'll turn it back to the public input. And we had Mark West has his hand raised.
Mark West, you are unmuted.
With this avoid, minimize, and mitigate, the question is going to be on larger scale projects with wetlands, the idea of avoidance sometimes says, have you evaluated other alternative properties? I think it may be more difficult to enforce that in the AoT realm, unless you're specifically impacting significant important habitat, and it's clear that this habitat loss is potential for denial or something. I don't know if you all were considering the whole idea of alternative site evaluations for something where they may own the property, they want to develop the property, and they may not have been citing it just based on shopping around for properties. And that is a case where if we have to do that, that needs to be spelled out. And also the minimization is pretty understandable, but I didn't see a lot of that in the outline, and maybe that was put in the template, and maybe that needs to be highlighted more. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. And we had more input. And before I call on him, this is not by any means commenting on Richard's comments, but I'm hopeful we have something on the order of 80 participants. So if you have anything to share, please don't be shy. Raise your hand. And at this point, we'll recognize Richard Head again. Thank you.
Go ahead, Richard.
Thanks, Rich. I'll try not to take up too much time. You'll be pleased to know I have a 3 o'clock meeting, so I actually have to bail in a couple minutes. So my only concern I would raise with the addition of an avoid, minimize, and mitigate standard is that it creates a little bit of a slippery slope in that, again, going back to Fish and Game Statute, RSA 212A3 talks about maintaining and enhancing threatened and endangered species, and 212A5 talks about it being unlawful to take. I'm not saying avoid, minimize, and mitigate should not be elements of consideration, but I would become very concerned that as compared to, and Ridge, as I think you were suggesting, wetlands are much different than species, and they're mobile, they can be killed, and can become extinct when we're talking about TNE species. So I think I would be very careful once you got past avoid and you got into minimize or mitigate, and I would suggest also that it could only be done after careful study. And after a thorough enough study to know that both the policies of maintaining and enhancing and the bright line standard of unlawful to take would not be lost. With that, I'll be happy to be muted again. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And I'm looking here, and if you could also remember to take your hand down. I want to make sure I'm calling on people, but not calling on them twice because their hands are still raised. We have Joshua Reap.
Hi, this is Joshua Reap from Associated Builders and Contractors, and we represent a lot of industrial, commercial, and some residential contractors here in New Hampshire. I want to echo a lot of the comments that have been said and also praise everyone here for putting this effort together. This is near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, finding a good balance with everything and making sure we have the right rules in place that protect what everyone here values in New Hampshire, which is the natural landscape and beauty and everything in it, along with balancing off with the need for development. One of the things that I was wondering is if in the process here, if we're considering any sort of timeline to be put in place as permits are put out there and applications are put out there, is there consideration to provide developers and people applying for permits like a surety of like, here's the timeline involved with this, just to kind of help bring some surety that a project can have an idea of what their timeline could be and avoid delays.
Yeah, Joshua, Ridgemark, I'll take a crack at that. It's certainly something the department or departments will consider, and I will say that almost all of our permitting programs have time limits associated with them, set by statute. So I would not be surprised by any means that this part of the equation, if you will also be subject to that. Now we'd have to look at, I mean, we currently have a 50-day timeline. If that was to be held for all aspects of an application, we may have to be looking at, and I don't know what at the end of the day, what the studies or assessment requirements are going to look like, and they can vary widely. So yes, there may be timelines. To take a stab at what those may be at this point, I think would be pure conjecture. I'll defer if anyone from Fish and Game has any comment on that.
I'll just add, not specific to the timeline. I think that's, there's, we're here to get public input on that, and this is somewhat related to the last question on the agenda here. But what we have discussed is, as part of the process and the guidance we've provided to applicants in the current rule and the current process is to start that communication early in the process. So we're given the same opportunity to interact and provide feedback to applicants as is done through the DES process. And so that's the primary focus has been, and the guidance to applicants is really trying to encourage them to engage us early in the process and not wait till they've submitted their their application to alteration of terrain. But moving forward, obviously we're taking input from folks today. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. I don't see for this question at this point any other hands raised, but we did have a couple questions. A couple of them are comments, so if I don't read those at this point for time, I mean, they certainly will be considered by the department, but some of the were questions, and we have one from Barbara Richter that says, she talks about it's obvious that avoidance is the best option for protection of T&E species. The last resort should be mitigation as an in lieu fee. In regards to avoidance and minimization, how will DES and Fish and Game determine if proposed avoidance strategies outlined in, Barbara, I apologize, might have reached your 256 character limit. I'm not quite sure how to finish that.
Ridge, should we, I can unmute Barbara, see if she wants to finish the question.
That would be perfect. Thank you.
Barbara, yep, Barbara, you are unmuted.
Great, thank you for the opportunity to ask a question here. Yeah, I'm just wondering, it looks like the direction that you're headed is to have the certified wildlife or the qualified wildlife biologist make some recommendations. And just to clarify a little bit, how is, you know, how will Fish and Game determine if those proposed avoidance strategies outlined in that report, the phase 1, would be appropriate and would not jeopardize the continued existence of a species? And just wondering how, you know, will Fish and Game be making their own recommendations on avoidance and minimization or best management practices as part of the, you know, I guess this kind of all leads back to the having rules will help outline this, but it's kind of hard to tell what role Fish and Game's going to play and what role the qualified wildlife biologist will play.
I'll try to answer a portion of that, Ridge, and I'll try to answer the second part of it. The first part is really what we're trying to get input on today, is input from the public. But the second part is, yes, Fish and Game and DES are both involved in the review of those wildlife studies and would be reviewing them and providing input and recommendations on how to improve them, being create a better situation for threatened and endangered species that may occur on the property. So that is part of the ongoing process for Fish and Game and DES's review and participation. Outlining specifically what that looks like in rule for where the line is for those is what we're looking for input on, but is obviously a little bit more challenging. And I will say that it's something that it's challenging, and it doesn't show up in a lot of other state rules or federal rules that I've seen. So that shows kind of some of the challenge in defining those barriers.
Great, that's helpful.
Okay, and at this point, I just want to state that I recognize there's a couple more questions here, and a couple that do not pertain to the avoid, minimize, and mitigate. They actually to some of the questions further below, so we'll come back to those. To once again try to give every question equal time, if you will. Let's move to question D. The current rule requires a site assessment study of the potential impacts of a project on T&E species and their habitat by a qualified wildlife biologist. Are there types of projects or sites that should be exempt from this assessment requirement? And should there be different tiers of site review assessment based upon the project characteristics, site setting, or other factors? I'll just add here what we're trying to get at, if it's not self-explanatory. We've had some discussions with people as to the perhaps differences or potential for exemptions for projects that may be in a heavily urbanized area versus a more, undeveloped rural area. And so that's what we're trying to get some input. Is there a valid reasons, and do you have ideas as to maybe having a tier level or even an outright exemption for certain type projects? And I see Rick Vanderpool has raised his hand.
Rick, you are unmuted.
Thanks, Tom and Ridge. Just a couple thoughts on this one that I know I submitted some in writing the other day, but in terms of rare species, I think my example was peregrine falcons in downtown Manchester. There's a possibility that we could find them pretty much in places that we don't expect them, especially as we sort of drill into the site assessment. And that's where I think it relies upon a qualified wildlife biologist to provide that information to demonstrate that a site should be exempt. And so that's necessarily going to include a natural heritage data check and sort of a phase 1 review of a particular site. I work all over the state. One example was finding a state endangered plant in downtown Dover, and I didn't expect it, but it was there. So that's the kind of thing where I think no particular area of the state should be exempt, but again, having a preliminary review option could therefore qualify for, yeah, nothing's likely here, no data records are here, and we've done the due diligence to make sure that that's true. So that I would support that kind of initial site assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And we have Zachary with his hand raised.
Yeah, good afternoon again. I mentioned this quickly in the first public input session, but I wondered whether or not you would consider exempting process projects that have gone under further environmental reviews or previous environmental reviews, such as environmental assessments conducted under NEPA. We often do those NEPA analyses in the 3 to 5 year time frame prior to construction, because we need to complete them to get our funding, and we rely on assessments or wildlife surveys that have been conducted sometimes over the course of a couple of years, as Jared Jones talked about. And then, you know, we compile them and put them in this environmental assessment. They go to the agencies for review. The agencies look at them, including Fish and Game, Natural Heritage Bureau, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They provide us input as to those impacts. We may identify mitigation measures that are going to be implemented to avoid and or minimize effects on those species. And so we've often gone through all of these steps ahead of applying for our alteration of terrain permit. And then the permit comes up and we feel like we're starting it all over again. And so I would ask you that you consider some process that allows for those existing reviews to potentially qualify to exempt a project, you know, pending new information becoming available that could change those results.
Thank you, Zachary. And we have Tom Gardner.
Go ahead, Tom.
I have comments about the wildlife biologist and the survey. I'm concerned about the relationship between the biologist and the
Tom, I'm not sure whether you're speaking. I'm hearing something very faint.
How about now? Can you hear me now?
That's a little bit better.
Okay, I'll try to speak up. I'm talking about the study and the relationship between the wildlife biologist and the developer. I'd like to see the independence maintained of the biologist, so that the developer doesn't hire the biologist directly. I'd like to see the developer pay a fee in addition. During the application process, there's a fee for the application, and that should pay for the biologist. And then the biologist be assigned by someone at Fish and Game, and that way the biologist is reporting to Fish and Game, and it's not working for the developer. Does that make sense? Do you understand me?
Yes, it does, Tom. I did hear you, and something I didn't mention earlier, which is great. I mean, any and all ideas, what you mentioned, I believe would take some statutory change, which is fine. That's available to us. It's just another step in the process. But thank you for your comment.
Oh, I had one question. From what
Sure.
I understand, the survey, this required survey has been in effect since June 2nd. And I'm just wanting to know how you've handled the relationship between the biologist and the developer since June 2nd. And that's all. Thanks.
Well, at this point, and Fish and Game may have a little bit more detail since they're communicating directly regarding review of the reports, but the reports are coming in by wildlife biologists who have been retained by either the agent, i.e. engineering consultant for the project, or the applicant themselves.
Ridge, this is Melissa with Fish and Game. I would say that's exactly true of how it's being done so far.
Thank you, Melissa. We did have another hand raised on this issue, Tucker Gordon.
Go ahead, Tucker.
Yeah, this is Tucker Gordon with HEB Engineers. I was wondering if you'd given any consideration to expansion projects versus new development and the scope of study that might be required for that. I'm thinking of, large already developed sites that are looking to do expansions which trigger AoT permitting for a variety of reasons. Those seem to potentially be quite different than a brand new, undeveloped lot being developed. And secondly, kind of as a follow-up, I was wondering if you'd given consideration to, we work on a variety of permits where the lot has been developed, but just to under the AoT threshold, and then minor additional development triggers AoT permitting. And we wind up having to permit the last 10 years of impacts. And I was wondering how that would work in the framework of the TNE species. Are the wildlife biologists supposed to be evaluating impacts that have occurred previously? Yeah, that's the end of my question. Thanks.
Well, this is Ridge Mock. I can speak to, that first part, when you're saying you have a permit and you're expanding it. Yes, current rules, we treat that as we need to have the study done. And there's a couple reasons for that, because the expansion could be getting closer to an area of concern, and equally as important, probably the first phase did not undergo a study of this level. And we can't be assuming just because it's a developed site that there's not a potential to further or initially impact a TNE species. So that's the thought there, but that's also why we're asking this question as to, ideas for having different tiers, as opposed to, and I think your second part of the question is, when you have a project that was just under the permit and now you have to come in for a permit, kind of a similar answer. I mean, I think you asked whether the wildlife biologist would have to evaluate impacts from the work that's already occurred. I think perhaps the way we would look at that is cumulative impacts, if you will. I mean, we're not at a point where I think we're considering that you'd have to do any kind of mitigation, because you were not at that point in violation, because we didn't have this type of rule. But I don't know if Fish and Game has anything to add to that.
Nothing to add at this time.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, let me see if I see any questions related to this. Actually, they're just comments, which we will take into consideration. Those are very helpful, and that's what we mean by provide instead of asking questions of us, which I understand are helpful, but comments for suggestions are helpful. Not seeing at this point, and we can always come back. Any other questions pertaining to there or comments pertaining to this? Let's move on to E. What type of mitigation could be appropriate for impacts to T&E after appropriate avoidance and minimization? And we give some ideas to get the thought process started, but we'd like some input on that question. I see Suzanne, excuse me, Suzanne Fournier has raised her hand.
Suzanne, you have been unmuted.
Suzanne, do you have a comment, or are you having difficulties with audio? While Tom maybe is, I don't know, behind the scenes, whether he's trying to help Suzanne on this. One question, kind of broad question, asked, will all the comments be available for the public to see, as that may generate further questions and comments? It's my understanding, yes. Certainly the last public input session, we had the recording, and I'm not sure whether we did post the questions, but I've got to imagine they're available, and we'll work towards providing those as well. Okay, I've just been told, Suzanne, if you can hear us, you could perhaps call in on the phone number that was provided. There seems to be some difficulty with your audio at this point. I see you just said that in a question. But she did pose the question, why would you ask about mitigation that is presently not allowed under RSA 212? Minimizing and mitigation are not legal. That is a statement. I am certainly not the one to get into legal issues, so I can't comment on that at this point, Suzanne. Okay, I don't see any other hands raised regarding suggestions for appropriate mitigation. So we'll move on to question F. Are there criteria that should result in denial of a permit application regardless of available avoidance, minimization, and mitigation measures? And this was Tom O'Brien earlier had some suggestions to this. We'd be looking for further comment. Now, I did see Kim Wood hand was just raised, whether it's pertaining to this question or the prior. Tom, would you recognize Kim Wood?
Kim, you are unmuted.
Oh, thank you. I think that one criterion that should result in denial of a permit application would be uncertainty of the impact. If it can't be determined, if it cannot be determined.
Okay, thank you, Kim. And just to give it a little bit more time, if someone else had a comment. I do see a question regarding the previous one on mitigation. Someone asks, and I'd have to defer to Fish and Game on this, would habitat creation like stump and rock piles be a valid idea?
I mean, I guess, let me get on video here. I think what you would be trying to do with a mitigation program is benefit the affected species. So it really depends on what particular species was impacted by a project and whether that activity is beneficial or substantially beneficial to that given species. That at least is the approach that's been followed through other state and federal process that I'm familiar with.
Thank you, Mike. And I see, unless it was not put down prior, Rick Vanderpool, did you have a comment on this question? Well, either one, because we are now down to, we're on the denial of a permit application criteria. Tom, would you recognize Rick?
Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
Thanks, Ridge. Yeah, I had one other thought about the sort of statute of limitations, as it were, on denial of a permit. I think the point about uncertainty is a good one relative to what we know and what we don't know. But in a case where we have a fragmented habitat and a historic occurrence of a threatened or endangered species that hasn't been seen in 20 years, and it's the professional opinion of Fish and Game staff that it's not a viable habitat anymore, I think that would be a reasonably safe bet to allow a permit. But in contrast, allowing a permit in an area where habitat is present and there's a chance that an animal could be using that habitat, this may sort of push the envelope relative to timing, because as we know, some of these species are not detectable except for a very small window of time. I mean, think of Carner blue butterfly flight periods and egg deposition. I mean, that's not a long period of time to detect a species that may be present or absent. So I would always err on the side of caution with that, and maybe get back at the question of alternative site analysis or alternative site placement for a particular project. So couple more comments to keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. And I'm scrolling currently through questions, and they do seem to be just comments. I want to emphasize that we will certainly take these into consideration. I'm going to scroll up because I think at one point we had someone who was talking about these issues. They expressed concern that the current rule is ripe for appeal since questions F and G does not have a particular process for reviewing studies, any timeline, or for comment, or how DES should use, should use F and G other than as consultation. Well, I think that's a comment that I can't respond to at this point, but certainly appreciate it, and we'll take that under consideration and advisement. Here is a question. I'm not quite sure how to answer it because it just says, would you have to provide for some minimal development on a property? I need some clarification. That was Jennifer McCourt. If you want to raise your hand or just be recognized, perhaps provide a little bit more context of that comment.
Jennifer, you are unmuted.
I guess my concern is that if you have a property that has a threatened or endangered species on it, that property owner, I would assume, have some rights to be able to develop that property in some way for a minimal development. I mean, would you be looking at saying nothing could be built on that land? It's just, I want to make sure that, you know, people don't have unbuildable lots.
Anyone from Fish and Game have any input on that?
Not a specific response. I mean, what you're referring to is you know, landowner rights versus you know, endangered species review, and I think that would require a legal decision of minimum requirements and further input there. So you know, I appreciate the input, and certainly something that would need to be looked at as part of the process.
Okay, I think at this point, not seeing any other comments or hands raised regarding that question. Let's move on to the last one. In the last session, several commenters expressed support for increased funding for Fish and Game to fulfill their responsibilities. Please share ideas for increasing the capacity of Fish and Game through funding. And here's some ideas. Would the funding be through existing fee mechanisms? Do you have any suggestions for a fee structure? And I'll open that up to comment. This point, and I apologize calling you out, so to speak, because I can't tell whether the hand was taken down. I've got too many things here I'm trying to keep track of. Rick Vanderpaul, did you have your hand up pertaining to this question?
Yes. Yes.
Great. Thank you, Rick.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I've spent a fair amount of the last 8 or 10 years trying to come up with funding strategies, including the advocating for and helping write SB 48, which created the Study Commission for Fish and Game, which was intended to look at the ways in which Fish and Game is funded. And as we, I think, all recognize, they are a severely underfunded department and need as much help as they can get. And if we drill into the details of this particular aspect of their services for the public, I think it would be incumbent upon us to, at the very least, levy a fee not unlike the data check tool fee of $25, which is, I think, pittance in and of itself, to allow them to do their job. I mean, this is several hours on a given project, if not dozens of hours on a given project, and this is all supposedly under their sort of normal task of duties, and yet the field is getting more complex. And so I will say again, we need to address this right up front and come up with a mechanism that however we can get it through the legislature to make sure that they have enough money to do the jobs that they are required to do. Because if they don't, we will suffer the consequences and the T&E list will only get larger. Thank you for that opportunity to voice my opinion.
Thank you, Rick. And Tom, would you recognize Zachary?
Go ahead, Zachary.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, again. I don't know how viable this really is, but there have been times in the past where we've actually used Fish and Game to do some stuff through interdepartmental agreements, which was really beneficial, I think, to both of us. And so I wonder if one of the options that could become available is that if there are applicants and they are trying to, get their qualified wildlife biologist out on site, whether part of that process could be, hiring a Fish and Game department employee to take on that task as one of the optional ways, as opposed to always, having to find consultants. I realize there's some conflict there, but I think maybe that's one option that could be explored.
Thank you, Zachary. We did get within the comments section a question: is DES considering sharing its fees with Fish and Game? I'm not even sure whether we would legally be able to do that without change statutorily, since all fees are set by statute. The answer right now is that is not under consideration, and that would require us kind of using an existing fee mechanism. So we would need statutory changes to change the fee, because we would need to increase our fees, current fees. I see Jim O'Brien has raised his hand.
Go ahead, Jim. Jim, you are unmuted if you'd like to make a comment.
I'm sorry, I thought it was talking. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. All right. Well, thanks. This is Jim O'Brien from the Nature Conservancy. Thanks for this conversation. And I guess I just wanted to pick up on Ridge, your last comment to this question, because I mean, I think when, I think our fee structures should cover the costs of what the fee is supposed to pay for, which in these cases is to see the permit through. And so if a step of the permitting process involves Fish and Game, then those who are applying for these permits should cover the costs of the review. If that review includes Fish and Game, then I think that fee structure should be increased to cover the full cost of the review. And I think to be fair to those applying for those permits, there should be clarity on a timeline, how the decisions are going to be made so that they understand as they're applying where the money's going and how those decisions are made and the timeline associated with them. So I understand that it takes an act of the legislature to increase those fees, but we've seen over time the legislature making those adjustments to fees if they understand how the money is going to be used and how it expedites or moves forward the process. So I think in this case, you would probably find a lot of support across stakeholders for an increase to an AoT fee if Fish and Game was going to be, the cost would be covered in order to make timely decisions on those permits. So thank you.
Thank you, Jim. And did Kim Wood have a comment?
Hi, it's Kim here. In the state of Vermont, on our income tax form, there's a place where they ask if you want to make a charitable donation like that to reduce, like if you're getting a refund. And I realize that New Hampshire does not have a state income tax, but I wonder if there's another mechanism similar to that, that Fish and Game could tap into, like property taxes or something.
Thank you, Kim. Your idea is noted. Okay, at this point, I don't see any more hands. I would hope. I've been trying to scroll through all these questions, comments, and if I've missed any, I apologize. Maybe you could send it again. Actually, a couple just came in. Okay. The question I think was asked, does Fish and Game currently receive any portion of the NHB review fee? Well, actually, I don't know the answer to that because that's a $25 fee. Can Fish and Game answer that?
The answer is no.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Another question, what would the budget or fee need to be increased to feasibly hire a person to exclusively review projects for Fish and Game? I don't think enough thought's given to that as whether one person would be sufficient. But if it was, I mean, we have, if it was tied in entirely to alteration of terrain, as opposed to other fee mechanisms, I can say that alteration of terrain currently gets somewhere in the vicinity of 200 applications a year. So that would give you a starting point, depending on how many people, at what level, you can get an idea of what the fee increase would be in that particular situation. Someone asks, how does the Division of Historical Resources secure funding? The DHR process is clear and straightforward for developers and no fee. Don't know how they get funding, and I frankly don't know their process Also, I can't comment on that, but thank you for sharing that comment. One more is, nope, I already touched on that one. Well, at this point, certainly you can keep submitting comments, questions. We do have some remaining time, as I said earlier. Our current rule, and we have discussed it to some level, but I figured we'd circle back if anyone had any comments they'd like to further add regarding the wildlife biologist requirement and the need for a report assessment. We have heard that we need, suggested we develop more clear guidelines. The hope was that that template was a good step in that direction. We have heard people state that the wildlife biologist maybe in certain cases is too high of a requirement. Some have suggested wetland scientists. I'm letting you know what we've heard. We have 20 more minutes in this scheduled discussion. If people would like to comment on not so much the existing rule as it stands, but ideas for moving forward and developing of another rule. I see Jennifer McCourt has raised her hand.
Jennifer, you are unmuted.
Okay, thank you. As far as the wildlife assessment document, my understanding is that's just a guidance document. It really hasn't been vetted through the stakeholders, and being just a guidance document, how much standing does that have? I think it should go through a rule process and be properly vetted. Also on the wildlife biologists, as I've said before, I think they should be certified. Whether we can put it underneath the wetlands scientist purview, I think that'd be a great thing to do also, because as somebody had said before, should fishing be doing all of these studies? No, you've got wetland scientists, soil scientists, engineers, all kinds of professionals that are certified and licensed through the state. And we have an ethical responsibility to do it correctly. And that gives the developers more people to be able to draw from to be able to get their project done. And I honestly believe that how it should be done. I mean, I think Fish and Game has come up with a good start, but I think it definitely needs to be vetted through all the stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Do we have any other comments? Okay, not seeing any at this point. I would just like to thank everyone for participating. This will be posted on the AoT webpage, the recording of it. We'll also post the questions so people can see some of the questions that perhaps we didn't get to or that were more like comments in format. Moving forward, as I said, I mean, this is the beginning step. The departments will now take this information we've gathered. I have heard that perhaps people feel we need further discussion with whether it's more focused groups. I will say the department has to keep these type things as a public forum. We do try to identify all the groups that we would think would have interest and make sure they're aware of these type meetings. If we determine further meetings are necessary on either specific points of a rule that we'll try to develop in draft form, that's certainly an option that we can exercise. So I would say future schedule is still to be determined, but I do want to stress that, this is the first step. We have not even drafted a rule at this point, so we welcome any further comments if people have them. And thank you again for participating today, and look forward to continued discussions. I don't know if anyone else on the panel has anything to add.
I'll just second Ridge, and thank you for everybody's time and input today. It's really critical to the process, and we greatly appreciate that. And we'll be looking for further input as we go through the process. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.